What's going on, everyone? Today we're going to get into one of my personal favorite stories in motocross and supercross racing, and that is the story of Trey Canard. So Trey's story is very unique and he's overcome quite a bit of adversity in his life. So what I want to do for you guys today is go ahead and start all the way back at the beginning of Trey's story as a kid and bring you all the way up to current times in 2024, where Trey is still making a big impact on the sport. Now, like I've said in some of my other story videos, it's really hard to capture somebody's life story in one YouTube video, but I'm going to go ahead and give it my best shot. We're just going to go through some of the highlights, the ups and the downs. So with that being said, we have to take it all the way back to when Trey was just 2.5 years old and he's just starting to ride a motorcycle. Trey, his brother, and his dad were all into racing motocross, and as Trey got bigger, it became really clear that he had a strong passion for racing and that he also was pretty talented. His dad ended up building him a mini bike track in the back of the motorcycle shop that he had started, so needless to say, Trey was constantly riding his bike whenever he could. He was progressing as a rider and really had a passion for motocross racing. They would go out and race on the weekends, and his dad was constantly wrenching on his bike. Then when he would have days or time off of work, he would also go work on the track that he built for Trey to help him progress even further in the sport. This would continue for about 10 or so years, and Trey began to see some success. He ended up starting to go to Loretta's, and he would do fairly well. No real breakout performances, but he clearly showed signs of promise. Then on one fateful day in May of 2003, everything changed. Trey's dad had a day off of work and he was using that time to go ahead and work on his track. Now, the tractor that his dad was using was only a 3-wheel style tractor, and unfortunately the tractor ended up tipping over, and in the process he either tried to jump out or just fell out and he ended up getting crushed. Now, unfortunately, Trey ended up finding his dad and they did end up getting him to the hospital, but unfortunately there was nothing they could do for him. So this was really a life-changing moment for Trey. Not only did he lose his dad, but he's the one that found him. And then on top of that, Trey had to carry the potential guilt of knowing that his dad died working on his track. Thankfully, Trey was able to turn to motocross racing as an escape and a way to kind of ease his mind and try to get away from the pain. He ended up still going to Loretta's and trying to compete, where he did fairly well, but all things considered, it was nothing to write home about. It was a lot to take on without dad. And his mom even asked him, "Trey, do you even want to still keep doing this?" Trey just kept pushing forward though, and eventually he ended up getting better and better results, and he went from being a top 5 guy to now he's winning the races, now he's winning championships, and by the time he turned 16, it was clear that he was going to go pro. At just 16 years of age, he ended up racing the last 4 AMA Pro Nationals, where he went 11, 10, 5, and 8th overall, and he ended up securing himself a full-time ride for the following season. Going into the Supercross season in 2008, Trey's life was changing quite a bit. Trey went from living with his family in Oklahoma to moving out to California and living with his mechanic. This might not seem like a lot on the surface, but when you think about it, Trey isn't even 18 yet, he hasn't had his dad for the last 5 years, and now he's moving to a completely different place with nobody really around him that can help him figure out how to do life. He really didn't even know how to do laundry. His mom just kind of showed him, okay, this is what you do, and whatever, and so here you go. Now obviously if Trey can figure out how to ride a dirt bike super fast, he can figure out how to do laundry, but at the same time, there was a lot of things happening really fast. So as Trey was preparing for his Supercross debut, in December, unfortunately, he went down and ended up breaking his left collarbone, which really wasn't a huge deal. He had broken it just the year before and came back just fine, but it did play a significant role in his trajectory because he was planning on racing the West Coast division, and this made it to where he would have to race the East Coast division. Now, this was especially significant because that meant he would have to face off against Ryan Villipoto. Now, most people will probably already know that Ryan Villipoto was extremely successful, but let's paint a picture of exactly how successful Ryan Villipoto was at this time. In 2007, Ryan Villipoto won the Supercross Lights West Coast Championship, and he did so by winning every single round except for one round where he got second. And then he finished off the season with a motocross championship, and the last race that he had done before going into the Supercross season was the Motocross of Nations, where he won in the MX Lights class, where the classes are combined between 250s and 450s, and in both motos, Ryan was on a 250 and he won both motos. So at this point, the expectations of Ryan Villipoto are at an all-time high. We see him beat pretty much everybody that there is, including all of the lights riders, and then we even saw him beat 450 guys like Ricky Carmichael, Tim Ferry, and even Antonio Caroli in Motocross of Nations. So going into Trey's Supercross debut, there was a little bit of press covering the fact that it was Trey's first ever race, but most eyes were on Ryan Villipoto. Going into the night show, Trey quickly grabbed more attention though by winning the heat race, and he was able to carry that momentum right into the main event. Coming out of the gate, he ended up getting the whole shot, and he just took off and never really looked back. On the other hand, Ryan Villipoto didn't get off to nearly as good of a start, and he ended up going down early in the race, and as he was going back through the field, he ended up tangling up with Josh Grant, who is coincidentally Trey's teammate. He did go down pretty hard, but he did end up getting back on the bike. Ultimately though, he ended up getting a DNF in round number 1, and Trey ended up leaving his first ever Supercross race with the win and the points lead. Going into the second round of Supercross, the narrative had completely changed. All eyes were on Trey and Ryan, and Trey got off to another early lead. There was a clear sense of urgency out of Ryan Villipoto to get to the front as he had that DNF from the first round, and you saw that come to fruition as he caught Trey and ended up yard sailing himself trying to go past Trey. Trey looked surprisingly calm and almost in a veteran-like move was letting Villipoto take the position and looked like he was just going to tuck in behind him, but instead he ended up tangling up with his back wheel and kind of tipping over and losing a position, but ultimately Trey ended up staying on the bike and only losing one position, which he was able to regain later on during the race. Villipoto also remounted and he was able to charge back to second place and salvage a pretty good finish, but he did that with only 2 turns to go. Going into the third round of Daytona, Trey had won his first and his second ever Supercross starts, and he had almost a 30-point lead over the championship contender Ryan Villipoto. Now, if that wasn't interesting enough already, things are going to get even more interesting as this is arguably the muddiest Supercross race of all time. Now, obviously, Ryan Villipoto is wanting to turn things around. He did show the speed in round number 2, and he didn't lose too many points with that second place finish, but he really needs to start beating Trey, as Trey is so far in the points, and this could be the round to do it with all this mud. He could probably go get his first win of the season, and Trey could probably make some rookie mistakes and maybe even get a DNF. But as the gate drops, that is not what ended up happening. Josh Grant ended up getting the whole shot, but Canard ended up taking the early lead, and he started stretching out quite the lead. Villipoto checked in behind him in second, and he was doing his best to track Trey down when he started making mistakes, and he had a couple of tip overs. Ultimately, Trey ended up riding like a true veteran, and he was still hitting a lot of the jumps even though there was puddles feet deep on the track. He did end up tipping over in one of the ruts, but he got up very quickly, and he was able to maintain about a 10 to 12 second lead throughout the entirety of the race, and he ended up taking home his third win in his third ever Supercross start. Now, this is an unconfirmed stat, but I have been unable to find any rider in the history of Supercross who's been able to win all 3 of their first 3 starts other than Trey. Now, Villipoto did come home in second, so he again didn't lose too many points, but with Trey not losing a single race thus far in the season and only 4 rounds left in the season, it was pretty much impossible not to consider Trey a serious title threat at this point. Going into round number 4, Villipoto finally got off to a good start ahead of Trey for the first time this season, and he ended up battling with Trey's teammate Josh Grant pretty hard, and they went back and forth all throughout the race. This ended up being a relatively uneventful race for Trey. He had a mid-pack start and he just quietly worked his way back up to 4th. This was the first time we saw Trey get a mediocre start in Supercross. He ended up working his way all the way up to right behind Martin Davalos, which was relatively a respectable finish, and at this point he had such a large points lead that it was going to work. Now, up in front of Trey was arguably one of the best battles this season and maybe of all time between Josh Grant and Ryan Villipoto. They went back and forth many times, and Villipoto didn't end up making the pass until the very last turn, and Grant actually drew back alongside him going over the last jump, where he ended up going down. But if he didn't go down on that last jump, it would have been a drag race to the finish. It would have been a very interesting finish. Not that it wasn't already an interesting finish, but that was definitely one of the highlights of the battles that season. Going into round number 5, Trey had to face more adversity as he went down in the heat race and had to go through the LCQ, which gave him a very bad lane selection for the main event, and this ended up unfortunately costing him as he got caught in a first turn pileup. Trey didn't end up going down himself, but he did end up having to stop, so he had to basically start last in the race, and he ended up picking his way through the field and worked his way all the way up to 4th once again. Up at the front, we had Josh Grant out in the lead once again, but he ended up missing a shift and that allowed Villipoto by, and Villipoto ended up securing his second win of the season. Even though Trey had finished in 4th at the last 2 races and Villipoto had won the last 2 races, Trey still had a 17-point lead going into round number 6, and there was only 2 rounds left, so things were really looking good for Trey. Going into round number 6, there was a lot of concerns about the track that night, and a lot of people were getting really sketchy in the whoop section and crashing. And we saw this on the opening lap when Villipoto got off to the early lead, and Trey Canard was following right behind him. Both riders ended up getting loose in the whoop section, and Trey actually went off the track and clipped a tough block. Now luckily Trey was able to save it, and he settled into second place behind Villipoto, who ended up pulling out to a bit of a lead. Eventually Nico Izzy, who was in third, ended up catching up to Trey, and he made a relatively aggressive pass on Trey, and this marked the first time that Trey had really been caught and passed in Supercross this season, and this did seem to shake him up a little bit. Shortly after being passed, Canard ended up coming up just a little bit short on a double, and then it looks like he probably cross-rutted going off the next jump, but whatever the case may be, he ended up flying off to the side of the track, and then he had to restart his bike, and this ended up putting him well outside the top 10. Canard did end up remounting the bike, and he did eventually work his way back to a 10th place finish to salvage some points, but unfortunately for Trey, Villipoto did end up holding on for the win, and this ended up meaning that they were going into the final round with only a 3-point difference between the two, and both riders had 3 wins on the season. So they were essentially tied, because if Ryan Villipoto were to win the final round and Trey were to get second, there is a 3-point gap between those positions, and the tiebreaker would be most wins, which would fall in favor of Ryan Villipoto. This meant that all Ryan Villipoto had to do was go out and win the final round, and that's something he had been doing successfully for the last couple of years. For the first time this season, Trey was under a lot of pressure. Going into the final round, Trey knew that he was going to have to get off to a good start and at least put himself in front of Villipoto to make things hard for him, and that's exactly what he did. He got off to a better start than Villipoto, and he was riding around in second. He was actually sandwiched between Villipoto and his teammate. Eventually, Trey ended up taking the lead, but Villipoto was right behind him. Shortly after that, Trey ended up making a small mistake and losing some traction out of a corner, and this allowed Villipoto to draw alongside him, and he ended up making the pass. Now Trey, having already overcome so much adversity just to get to this point, and having been the points leader for every single round this season, was not about to let it go that easily, so Trey began stalking Villipoto, and then the very next lap, Villipoto made just the slightest bobble on the jump just before the finish line, and Trey seized his chance and jumped to the inside. He ended up making contact with Villipoto, and Villipoto went flying off the side of the finish line jump, and unfortunately, he ended up going down. There was a bit of controversy behind this move, but ultimately it ended up giving Trey his Supercross championship in his first ever Supercross season. We've seen rookies come in and win championships before, but we've never seen anything quite like what Trey displayed. His grit and determination was unmatched, and the belief in himself and confidence was really inspiring. Trey was looking to carry that momentum going into the motocross season, and he got off to a reasonably good start with a couple of top 10s to start off the season, and eventually he ended up breaking onto the podium with a second place overall at Redbud. Unfortunately for Trey, he would not be able to keep the ball rolling, and he had his first major injury of his professional career when he went down at Washougal and he ended up breaking his femur. This obviously ended up ending Trey's season, but surprisingly enough, he came back for the start of the West Coast series of Supercross, which was a bit of an odd choice because he was the defending champion of the East Coast series, and then on top of that, it was an earlier start to the series than the East Coast series, which would have allowed him more time to recover from his broken femur. Trey's second Supercross season ended up getting off to a bit of a rough start where in the first lap, he ended up getting tangled with defending champion Jason Lawrence, and they both ended up going down. Trey was able to salvage a 12th place finish, but really not off to the type of start that he would be looking for if he was going to be contending for another championship. Then, in round number 2 in Phoenix, he crashed hard again, and this time he suffered a concussion. This caused him to miss the main event of that race as well as round number 3, effectively eliminating him from any championship hopes. Trey did end up coming back for the remainder of the season, and he was able to at least get 3 podiums, and he was able to win the final round of the West Coast Division in Salt Lake City. Trey once again looked to carry his momentum from Supercross into the motocross season, and this time he was able to get off to a much better start with a 5th place in the opening round, and then he jumped all the way up to 2nd place at round number 2, and then he backed that up with another podium at round number 3, and then he was battling for the win at round number 4 in Highpoint, when unfortunately he ended up going down pretty hard, and he ended up suffering some pretty extensive right arm injuries. He ended up having a fracture in his radius and his ulna, and while this was nothing new for Trey as he had suffered the exact same thing on his left side back in 2001, it was still frustrating as it looked like his momentum was finally starting to build, and he was potentially putting himself in contention for a motocross championship. It is now 2010 and Trey is lining up for his third Supercross season. He got off to a relatively solid start with a second place finish behind Jake Weimer, but then he fell back to 7th at round number 2, got back on the podium at round number 3 with a 3rd, and then he got his first win of the season in San Francisco at round number 4. Then he dropped all the way outside the top 5 with a 6th place at round number 5. And then at round number 6 at Anaheim 3, he got another win. Interestingly, the points leader Jake Weimer, who has won 4 out of the 6 races so far, ended up having a pretty bad race with an 8th place finish, and this put Trey in 2nd in the points, only 14 points behind Jake. With only 2 rounds left in the season, he was within reasonable striking distance going into the break. But as the West Coast class took a break for the East Coast division, Trey did not take a break as he jumped on the 450 because his teammate in the 450 class, Andrew Short, ended up suffering a leg injury at San Diego, so Trey took the opportunity to get his feet wet in the 450 class. Things got off to a little bit of a rocky start at Indianapolis when Trey got 20th, but then he went on an absolute run where he did not finish off the podium for the next 5 rounds, with a 2nd at Atlanta and then 3rds at the remaining rounds in Daytona, Toronto, Arlington, and Jacksonville. This was reminiscent of Trey's 250 debut, where he went on to win his first 3 ever races in the class, and Trey went on a 5-race podium run right after his 450 debut. It was really cool to see Trey and his capabilities in the 450 class, and as things transitioned back to the West Coast and Trey got back on the small bike, it looked like the momentum was really on his side and he could be a legitimate championship threat. But unfortunately, at the next round in Seattle, he ended up finishing outside the top 10 with an 11th place finish, and Jake Weimer ended up finishing on the podium, and this effectively ruled Trey out of a real title threat going into the final round. Of the 2010 motocross season, Trey was still seen as a true contender, but the hype around him being a championship contender had begun to die off just a little bit. But in typical Trey fashion, Trey got off to a hot start with the podium at round number 1 and then another top 5 at round number 2, but unfortunately he fell off the pace just a little bit with a couple of 7th place finishes in the following rounds, and leaving Budds Creek at round number 4, he had already fallen to 5th place in the championship, 49 points behind championship points leader Christophe Pourcel, and it seemed like he was already effectively out of the championship battle. Then, just when you counted him out, Trey ended up putting it all together, and he finished on the podium at 7 of the 7 next rounds, with 5 of them being overall wins, and he won 8 out of those 14 motos. Trey was coming on extremely strong at the end of the season, and when they left Steel City with 1 round to go, Trey had closed the points gap all the way down to 7 behind Christophe Pourcel, who had been riding extremely well, but when Trey had been winning so many motos, it's hard not to lose points. So going into the final round, Trey just needed to win both motos and have Christophe Pourcel finish off of 2nd place in one of the motos, and the championship would be his. But unfortunately for Christophe Pourcel, he would never even get the chance to try to finish on the podium, as he ended up crashing out and not being able to finish either moto, and Trey was able to actually coast it in for the championship. Now I remember actually being at this race, and at the time I was a huge Trey Canard fan, and seeing it in person, it was a really cool moment for Trey, and it's definitely been ingrained in my memory ever since. And with that, Trey had a championship in both Supercross and Motocross. Going into the 2011 season, it was time for Trey to make his full-time 450 debut, and the expectations were relatively high after seeing his 450 performance the season before. He got off to a relatively strong start, finishing in the top 5 at all of the first 3 rounds, with one of them being on the podium, and then he had a few rough finishes, but then he turned things all around in Houston, where he ended up getting his first ever Premier Class win, and he followed that up with 2 more wins in Jacksonville and Arlington. It looked like Trey was really starting to put things together, and just like his 250 Supercross debut season, now in his 450 debut season he also had 3 wins, but unfortunately he ended up going down in a practice crash and he broke his femur, which did not allow him to finish the remaining 3 rounds of Supercross. Going into the Pro Motocross Series, unfortunately, Trey was nowhere to be seen as he was still trying to recover from that femur injury, but at round number 7 in Spring Creek, he ended up returning, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly knowing Trey, he was able to get on the podium with a 3rd place finish. And then going into Washougal, he was riding pretty good when something truly unthinkable ended up happening. He ended up going down on a scrub attempt, and this ended up breaking his femur for the second time, not only that year, but also for the second time at Washougal. If you remember back in 2008, he also broke his same left femur at Washougal. So now this will be the third time that Trey has broken that same left femur, and he was out once again only 2 races into his return. This obviously caused Trey to miss the remainder of the 2011 season, and it even caused Trey to miss round number 1 of the 2012 Supercross season, but amazingly, he ended up lining up for round number 2 in Phoenix, and he was able to bring home a solid 7th place finish. Then at round number 3, Trey was looking to build off of that momentum and continue his season, when unfortunately, on the very first lap, he ended up grabbing a tough block cover, and that slowed him down to where he was not able to triple. So he was in the process of doubling while everyone else around him was tripling. He did his best to stay off to the side, but unfortunately it was not good enough.
Double singles in a huge wreck, as I said, involving Canard, Morris, and Pike.
And Ryan Marias ended up coming down hard and landing on Trey, which ended up causing a burst fracture of Trey's T11 and putting his whole spinal cord at risk. Trey had suffered many injuries throughout his career, but nothing quite like this, and this was really scary, as just being able to walk again was quite the accomplishment. Unlike so many of Trey's other injuries, Trey did not come back to the scene very quickly, and he ended up sitting out the entirety of the remainder of that season. Initially, the doctors were saying that Trey would not even be able to return for the start of the 2013 season, but Trey ended up proving them wrong, and he was able to get himself back in race shape for the start of the Supercross season. And he did seem to have a slightly different approach to the Supercross season. He was still showcasing the same speed and talent, but maybe just toning things back a little bit, trying to keep things a little bit safer and stay off the ground. Because if you look back, he really wasn't able to race very much recently due to so many injuries, because when he returned from his femur injury, he was only able to do 1 round of motocross, and when he returned from that, he was only able to do 1 round of Supercross before he broke his back. So it had been almost 2 years since Trey was able to consistently compete, and this time he was able to get through the full Supercross season healthy. He did end up missing 1 round, but other than that, Trey was healthy, and he ended up bringing home 3 podiums and finishing 6th in the point standings. Then going into motocross, he did something relatively similar, where he was able to compete at every single round except for 1, and he ended up getting 3 podiums in that as well, and he came home 4th in that championship. Going into the offseason, it seemed like Trey had the ball rolling once again, and it was nice to see him get through a full season relatively healthy. But during the season, Trey was pretty vocal about the fact that this was the first time that he was ever really scared to get on his dirt bike, and he was concerned that another big injury was coming soon. Unfortunately, those concerns would be realized in the offseason, as Trey ended up breaking his left radius leading into the Supercross season, and this caused him to miss the majority of the Supercross season. He was able to return for the final 5 rounds, where he did relatively well. He finished in the top 10 every single time, and he also brought home 3 top 5 finishes. But going into motocross, he really started to excel. In the first 8 rounds of motocross, Trey did not finish outside the top 4 overall, and things were really looking good for Trey. But then he made it to round number 9, and he had to face his nemesis, Washougal. Thankfully, Trey was able to make it through Washougal without any major incident. He did end up bringing home a 7th place finish, which honestly, I don't know if I would ever be able to step foot in that place again after what he had been through there so many times. And then he rebounded nicely with 2 2nd place finishes, and then he finished off the season going 1-1 for the win overall at the final round in Utah. It was really cool to see Trey realize his potential and finish off the season strong and bring home a premier class motocross win. Going into 2015, the question was, would Trey be able to be a championship contender in Supercross? He started off pretty strong with the podium at round number 1, but then the championship expectations soon fell away, as he finished 8th and then 11th at the following rounds. But then he was able to bounce back and get a win at the 4th round in Oakland, and then he stayed on the podium from there and even got another win at San Diego, and he continued his strong run of finishes, staying on the podium pretty consistently. But then unfortunately in Detroit, he ended up coming together with Jake Weimer, and he broke that same left radius once again, and that knocked him out for the remainder of the Supercross season. Going into 2016, it didn't really feel like Trey was a true title threat anymore, but it still seemed like he would probably be able to contend for race wins now and then. Unfortunately, it seemed like the injuries had really gotten to Trey, whether that was just holding him back in performance or mentally. Either way, he wasn't quite up to par compared to his previous results. I would speculate that he was probably just trying to ride a little bit safer, as he was able to complete quite a few more races. He did end up missing a couple of rounds at the beginning of the season, but overall he competed in the majority of the Supercross season, and he did bring home a plethora of top 5 finishes, but he also never finished better than 4th. Going into motocross, he did look to have the speed, and he started off with 3 top 5 finishes, but then he had a crash in practice and ended up bulging a disc in his back, and given the history with his back injuries, that was taken quite seriously, so he did miss a few rounds, and then he came back and got a 6th place overall, and then he had another crash and got a concussion, which caused him to miss the rest of the 2016 season, and it ended his professional stint with Honda Racing. Now, this was a bigger deal than it might seem on the surface, as Honda was the only team that Trey had ever raced for, and he had been with them for almost 10 years, so it was kind of weird seeing Trey leave Honda, and everything was really kind of up in the air for Trey. But luckily, he was able to sign with KTM Factory Racing going into 2017, and this kind of reignited the hype around Trey. Unfortunately, the hype would be short-lived, as he ended up injuring himself right at the start of the Supercross season. He did end up returning intermittently throughout the Supercross season, but ultimately, he was only able to complete 6 Supercross races, with his best finish being an 8th place finish. He did suffer a rotator cuff injury, and he also suffered from a virus that knocked him out at the end of the season, so he's trying to get himself healthy for the start of motocross. And then, unfortunately, when it looked like everything was coming together for him to come back for motocross, he ended up breaking his collarbone, and he had to miss the start of motocross. Trey was able to return in the middle of the season, where he was able to grab a couple of 12th place finishes, but really nothing that was inspiring. Then, as Trey was preparing for the next round at Southwick, he ended up sustaining another practice crash, and this ultimately ended up making him choose to sit out Southwick, and ultimately, Trey never returned to professional racing again after that. Just a couple weeks after his practice crash, Trey Canard ended up announcing his retirement from pro racing, and at the young age of 26, Trey Canard never raced pro motocross or supercross ever again. He never came out and said it directly, but the narrative surrounding Trey's retirement is that he was tired of crashing and getting hurt, and understandably, he just couldn't take it anymore. The results weren't there anymore, and the injuries were. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Trey ended up retiring. Over the next few years, we didn't really hear a whole lot out of Trey. He did end up partnering back up with Honda, and he became a test rider. Now, more recently, Trey has become more active on social media. We've begun to see exactly what his role at Honda is, and we've seen him become more and more involved and engaged in the motocross community. He's even returned to do some one-off races here and there. But more importantly, he's helping to develop the Honda of the future, and it seems like he has a pretty big role as far as developing the bike that the Lawrence brothers are racing on, as well as Shimoda and Hymas. He does step down to the 250 and help develop that, and it's cool to see Trey still heavily involved in motocross, and especially being involved at Honda, which helped him throughout the majority of his pro career. While exactly where Trey goes from here remains to be seen, one thing that is for certain is that Trey has definitely left his mark on the sport. It was awesome to see him splash onto the scene and win a championship so quickly, and it was awesome to see him get his pro motocross championship. It's been hard to see him go through as many injuries as he's had. As far as the injuries that we know, he has broken his right humerus, his right thumb, his left radius 3 times, his left ulna, his T8, his sternum, his left scapula, his left styroid process, his left clavicle twice, his left femur 3 times, his right radius, his right ulna, and his T11. He's also had 20 concussions and 11 surgeries. And while that list is not anything to be proud of, what is something to be proud of is the amount of times that Trey has gotten knocked down and come back. It was really hard to see him get injured so many times throughout his career, but it's awesome to see that he's still a part of the sport and he's still able to do what he loves. I personally find Trey's story really inspiring, and I've always looked up to Trey even before all of his injuries, so I just wanted to come in here and put the story together. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Definitely feel free to check out my other story videos. I have a playlist on here, and I will also link them down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.